My husband left me for my boss, certain he'd traded up to money and power. What he never knew was that I wasn't just her employee. I was the woman who signed her paycheck, and his. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Olivia Hayes. I'm 34 years old, and for 6 years I was married to a man named Ryan Carter. To everyone at my office, I was just a marketing coordinator at Sterling Group, quiet, reliable, never asking for too much attention. What none of them knew, not even Ryan, was that I wasn't just an employee. After my mother passed away, I inherited control of the family trust that owned Sterling Group. I could have walked in and taken a corner office on day one. Instead, I chose to use my mother's maiden name and start at the bottom, learning the company the same way she had quietly, without anyone treating me differently because of what I controlled. I never told Ryan the truth. Part of me wanted to know if he loved me for who I was, not what I had. Looking back, I think some part of me already sensed I needed to know that. Our marriage hadn't been easy for a while. Ryan was ambitious in a way that left little room for anything that didn't shine. He worked in sales at another firm, always chasing the next promotion, the next title, the next way to prove he'd made it. My job embarrassed him. He'd bring it up at dinners with his coworkers, calling it cute or low-key, like it was something I did to pass the time rather than a real career. I let the comments slide more often than I should have. I told myself every marriage has its rough patches, that things would settle once he got the recognition he wanted. Then came the company gala that fall. Sterling Group threw one every year, and that year Ryan finally got invited as my +1, mostly because a few of his contacts would be there. I remember the exact moment things shifted. Vanessa Cole walked into the room, in charge, polished, the kind of woman who filled a space without trying. She was Sterling Group's VP of operations, and technically, she was my boss. Ryan straightened up the second he saw her. He asked me who she was, and I told him, plainly, nothing more. I watched his eyes follow her across the room for the rest of the night, and something in my stomach told me this was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to undo. After the gala, Ryan found new reasons to mention Vanessa's name. At first it was small things, a project at his firm that somehow connected to Sterling Group, a networking event he had to attend because someone from her circle would be there. He started going to dinners and conferences I wasn't invited to, telling me they were strictly business, nothing I needed to worry about. I didn't argue. I just noticed how often his calendar suddenly filled up with things involving people he'd never mentioned before. It made me think back to when we first met, in our junior year of college. Ryan was different then. He used to walk me to class even when it was out of his way, and he'd save up his work-study paycheck to take me to the diner near campus on Friday nights. Nothing fancy, just us talking for hours. He used to say he didn't care about having a big house or a big title. He just wanted a life that felt like home. I missed that version of him more than I let myself admit. At home, the comparisons got sharper. He'd come back from one of his events and mention, almost without thinking, how put together Vanessa looked, how she carried herself in a room, how she talked about strategy and growth like she'd built something real. Then he'd look at me in my work clothes, plain and comfortable, and ask why I never dressed for, where I wanted to be instead of where I was. When I'd talk about my day, a project I was proud of, a small win at the office, he'd cut me off halfway through, telling me he already had enough on his plate without hearing about marketing meetings. I started noticing other things too. He began coming home later, always with an explanation ready before I could even ask. He bought new cologne, something sharper and more expensive than anything he used to wear. He signed up for a gym membership out of nowhere and started going almost every morning. I didn't say anything. I've spent years learning how to watch quietly, how to notice the small shifts in numbers and people at work before anyone else catches on. This wasn't so different. I just didn't want to admit what I was seeing. One night he came home, dropped his bag by the door, and mentioned Vanessa's name again, casually, like it belonged in our conversation now. It was the third time that week. He didn't notice my silence. He never seemed to notice much about me anymore. I sat there finishing my tea, saying nothing, while something in my chest tightened a little more than it had the night before. The dinners with Vanessa kept happening, and Ryan always had a reason ready. A client wanted to meet somewhere quiet. A deal needed to be discussed outside the office. I stopped asking for details after a while, mostly because his answers came too fast, like he'd rehearsed them before I even opened my mouth. His phone started buzzing late at night too, after I'd already gone to bed. He'd step out of the room to answer, voice low, door half closed. Around the same time, something came across my desk at work that had nothing to do with him, or so I thought at first. Part of my role, hidden from everyone outside a small circle, was reviewing financial reports across departments. Vanessa's expense reports that month didn't add up the way they should have. Dinners billed as client meetings with no client names attached. Hotel charges on nights when there were no conferences scheduled. I wasn't looking for anything personal. I was simply doing what I'd always done, checking numbers that didn't make sense. But the dates on her calendar matched nights Ryan had told me he was working late. One evening, I asked him something small, whether he wanted pasta or rice for dinner. He snapped at me, asking why I always needed an answer to every little thing, why I couldn't just handle it myself for once. It wasn't about dinner. I could see that much on his face, the guilt sitting right behind his irritation. He apologized a minute later, mumbling something about work stress, but the moment had already shown me more than he meant it to. I called Daniel Reyes that week, my attorney and one of the few people I trusted completely. I didn't tell him everything, just that something felt off at home, that Ryan seemed distant and short-tempered in ways he never used to be. Daniel listened carefully, the way he always did, and told me gently that he'd seen this pattern before in other marriages he'd handled, and that I shouldn't ignore what my gut was telling me. He didn't push further. He just asked me to be careful with myself. A few nights later, I was hanging up Ryan's jacket after he tossed it on the chair instead of the closet. Something crinkled in the inside pocket. I pulled it out without thinking much of it. It was a hotel receipt, dated 2 days earlier, a night he'd told me he was stuck at the office. I stood there holding it for a long moment before I let myself feel anything at all. I waited until he got home the next evening. I set the receipt down on the kitchen table without a word and watched his face change as he realized what it was. I asked him plainly where he'd really been that night. For a second, I thought he might lie again, come up with some excuse about a coworker or a mix-up. Instead, he just sat down across from me, quiet, and then said it outright. He'd been with Vanessa. He didn't look ashamed saying it. If anything, his voice had a strange edge of relief, like he was glad to finally stop pretending. I asked him how long it had been going on. He said long enough that he'd stopped feeling guilty about it. Then he leaned back in his chair and told me something that I think he'd been holding in for months. He said I was never going to be enough for him, that he'd married me thinking we'd build something bigger together. But somewhere along the way he realized I just didn't have it in me. He said Vanessa was different. She had ambition. She had a future he actually wanted to be part of, money, status, people who respected her the moment she walked into a room. Then he brought up my job, like he'd been waiting for the right moment to say it. He told me Vanessa was the kind of woman who actually ran something, who built a career people noticed, not someone content shuffling papers in a marketing department for 10 years. He said it like it was a simple fact, not realizing how far off he actually was. I didn't argue with him. I didn't cry, even though something inside me wanted to. I just looked at him for a moment and told him I wanted a divorce. He blinked, clearly not expecting it to come that fast or that calmly. I think some part of him had been preparing for a fight, for tears, for me to beg him to stay. When none of that came, he almost seemed thrown off, but he recovered quickly. Nodding like this was simply confirmation that he'd made the right choice. By the end of that week, he'd packed his things and moved out, eager to start his new life with Vanessa without any delay. He kissed me on the cheek on his way out the door, almost gentle, like he believed we were parting on good terms. He had no idea my calm wasn't weakness. He just didn't know me well enough anymore to tell the difference. Daniel handled the divorce paperwork for me, and I let him guide most of it. Ryan had clearly braced himself for a long fight, especially over money. He kept mentioning things to Daniel through his own lawyer, the house, the savings, the car, like he expected me to dig in and argue over every piece. I didn't. I agreed to most of it without much resistance, which seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. I think he wanted a fight. It would have made leaving feel justified. What Ryan never thought twice about was the prenup he'd signed years earlier, back when we first got married. He'd waved it off at the time, calling it a formality, something his lawyer friend told him to sign just to be safe. He never read it closely, never asked why certain assets were listed the way they were. He had no idea that document quietly protected everything tied to the Hartwell family trust, the same trust that, unknown to him, sat behind Sterling Group itself. He'd signed away more than he realized, all without paying attention. While the paperwork moved forward, Ryan and Vanessa wasted no time settling into a new apartment together, sleek, modern, exactly the kind of place he used to point at in magazines. He took pictures of the view, the furniture, the two of them standing in the kitchen like they were starting a life from a catalog. He seemed proud, like every photo was proof he'd finally arrived somewhere better. I didn't spend my time grieving in public or explaining myself to anyone. Instead, I poured myself into work, the real work most people at Sterling Group still didn't know I was responsible for. There was a restructuring coming, one I'd been planning quietly for months, long before any of this happened. Only a handful of people in the boardroom knew what was coming, and I intended to keep it that way until the right moment. A few weeks later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Ryan had told a friend, over drinks, that leaving me was the best decision he'd ever made. He said it with full confidence, like the story was already finished and he'd come out ahead. He had no idea how much of the story he still didn't know. A few months later, Vanessa pulled some strings and got Ryan a position closer to executive operations at Sterling Group itself. He left his old sales job without hesitation, convinced this was the real start of the life he'd been chasing. He talked about it constantly, the new title, the bigger office, the people who suddenly knew his name in meetings. For the first time in a long while, he seemed genuinely happy, like he'd finally landed exactly where he believed he belonged. It didn't take long for him to start hearing things around the office, mostly in passing, about a name that came up whenever serious decisions needed approval. People referred to it simply as H-Trust. No one seemed to know much beyond that, only that certain reports had to be prepared a specific way before being sent up for review, and that occasionally, someone from H-Trust requested a private briefing that even senior staff weren't included in. Ryan asked Vanessa about it once. She brushed it off, telling him it was just standard oversight, nothing worth worrying about. As quarterly review season approached, Vanessa changed. She grew tense, snapping at small mistakes, double and triple checking numbers she normally wouldn't think twice about. She started controlling details around Ryan too, what he could say in meetings, who he could talk to, how he should present himself. He noticed a sharper, colder side of her he hadn't seen before, one that didn't match the confident, easygoing woman he'd fallen for. Then came the small humiliations. Vanessa started attending certain meetings alone, telling Ryan they were just for department heads, even when his role technically qualified him to be there. He'd wait outside sometimes, watching people file in without him, feeling like an outsider in the very world he thought he'd earned a place in. It bothered him more than he admitted out loud, this growing sense that he was seen as her boyfriend first and a professional second. Then one morning, an internal memo went out company-wide, announcing a surprise in-person visit from a representative of the Hartwell Trust. The name attached to the visit was Olivia Hartwell. Ryan read it twice at his desk, the name sitting oddly familiar in his mind, though he couldn't quite place why. He shrugged it off and went back to his coffee, no idea how close that name actually was to the life he used to have. The week before the visit, the entire office shifted into a different gear. Reports got rewritten twice over, presentations rehearsed late into the evening, and the executive team moved through the halls like every detail mattered more than usual. Vanessa was at the center of it, barely sleeping, snapping at anyone who slowed her down. Ryan tried to help where he could, but most of the time she waved him off, telling him to focus on his own work and let her handle the rest. It was during one of those long nights that Ryan started noticing the gaps in what Vanessa told him about her own position. She'd always talked like she answered to no one, like she was the top of the chain at Sterling Group. But watching her now, scrambling to satisfy someone she clearly feared disappointing, he realized that wasn't true. She answered to someone above her, someone she never spoke about by name, and whoever it was made her more nervous than he'd ever seen her. One night, after another tense day, an argument broke out between them at the apartment. It started over money, Ryan questioning why their expenses had gotten tighter despite both their incomes. Vanessa turned it back on him, asking pointedly whether he was even executive material, whether he understood what it took to operate at her level. The fight spiraled further when he brought up a comment a coworker made about Vanessa getting a little too friendly with a senior partner from another firm. She didn't deny it outright. She just told him not to make assumptions, which somehow felt worse than a denial would have. While all of this unfolded around him, I sat with Daniel one evening, going over the final details of my visit. I asked him honestly whether I was ready to step out from behind the name I'd been hiding behind for years. He reminded me gently that this had never really been about hiding forever, only about learning who people truly were before they knew what I had. He told me I already knew the answer. I think I did too. The morning of the board meeting, Ryan arrived early, hoping to get ahead of the chaos. At the front desk, he glanced down at the visitor badge list sitting near the sign-in sheet. One name caught his eye, unfamiliar at first glance. Olivia Hartwell. He stared at it a moment longer than he meant to, something about it tugging at the edge of his memory, before he shook it off and walked toward the boardroom. I walked into the boardroom exactly on time, dressed the way I always dressed for these meetings, simple, sharp, nothing flashy. The room went quiet the moment I stepped through the door. A few people exchanged glances, clearly recognizing my face from somewhere in the building, but unable to place it next to the name on the visitor list. I didn't wait for introductions. I took my seat at the head of the table, where the Hartwell Trust representative was expected to sit, and let that alone answer most of the unspoken questions. Vanessa was seated near the front, papers in hand, ready to deliver the presentation she'd spent days preparing. The moment she looked up and saw me, her face changed completely. The confident posture she always carried into rooms like this one disappeared in an instant. She knew exactly who I was from my time at the company, just not what name I'd been operating under all along. I watched the realization settle over her, slow and unmistakable, that the person she'd been quietly afraid of disappointing for months had been sitting 2 floors below her the entire time. Toward the back of the room, Ryan sat as Vanessa's +1, there mostly to observe. I felt his eyes on me before I even looked his way. When I finally did, I saw the color drain from his face. It didn't take him long to connect everything: the name on the badge, the trust everyone whispered about, the wife he'd left without a second thought. He sat frozen, gripping the arm of his chair, saying nothing. I didn't address either of them directly. I spoke to the room the way I always did in these meetings, calm, measured, focused entirely on the numbers and the plan ahead. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. The weight of who I was, and how long I'd been quietly watching everything from the inside, said more than any reaction could have. When the meeting ended, I gathered my things and walked toward the door. Ryan shifted forward slightly, as if hoping to catch my eye, maybe even say something. I felt his gaze land on me one more time as I passed his row. I didn't turn my head. I walked straight past him and out of the room, leaving him sitting there with everything he thought he understood about his life quietly falling apart behind me. In the weeks that followed, I oversaw a formal review of leadership at Sterling Group, working closely with the board and legal team to document everything properly. The concerns about Vanessa weren't invented or exaggerated. Her judgment had been compromised for months, her conflicts of interest clear once people actually looked, especially her relationship with a subordinate who reported indirectly through her own chain. I didn't need to raise my voice or make it personal. The paperwork spoke for itself. Vanessa was removed from her position quietly, with no public announcement, no dramatic farewell. But word travels fast in this industry, and within weeks, people in similar roles at other companies knew exactly why she'd left. Doors that used to open easily for her started staying shut. I never had to say a single negative word about her to anyone. The facts did all the damage on their own. Ryan's situation unraveled almost as fast. Once people in the office understood who he used to be married to, the way they treated him shifted noticeably. Conversations got shorter. Invitations to certain meetings stopped coming. The promotion he'd been so proud of started feeling more like a formality nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud. He went from feeling like he'd arrived to feeling like he was barely tolerated, watched closely by people who weren't sure what to make of him anymore. One afternoon, he managed to get 5 minutes alone with me near the elevators. He started apologizing, stumbling over his words, telling me he never meant for things to go this far, that he hoped we could at least talk like adults. It didn't take long to hear what he was really asking for, some reassurance that his job was safe, that I wouldn't let what happened between us affect his career. I listened without interrupting, then told him plainly that decisions about his position would be based on performance and conduct, the same as anyone else's. Nothing more. He nodded slowly, clearly hoping for something warmer, and walked away with nothing. Not long after, his relationship with Vanessa fell apart completely. With both their careers under pressure and the life they'd pictured together crumbling, the blame started flying between them. She accused him of dragging her down by association. He accused her of using him to get ahead and discarding him the moment it became inconvenient. Neither of them seemed willing to admit their own part in what they'd lost. Months passed, and I settled fully into my role at the Hartwell Trust, no longer working under a different name, no longer staying quiet about who I was. People at Sterling Group and beyond knew me now, not as someone's wife or a marketing coordinator, but as the person making real decisions that shaped the company's future. It felt strange at first, being seen so clearly after years of staying in the background, but it didn't take long to feel like exactly where I belonged. I think about the marriage sometimes, honestly, without trying to soften it. It hurt in ways I didn't expect, even after everything Ryan did. But I've also come to understand that his betrayal pushed me towards something I might have avoided for years otherwise. I'd been comfortable hiding, telling myself it was about humility or caution. Losing that marriage forced me to stop hiding and finally live as the person I actually was the whole time. Rebuilding didn't happen overnight, and I didn't rush it. Daniel remained one of the steadiest people in my life, someone I could sit with over coffee and talk through decisions, both personal and professional, without judgment. I reconnected with parts of myself I'd set aside during the marriage, old hobbies, old friendships, a sense of direction that belonged entirely to me. I wasn't interested in jumping into anything new with anyone else. For the first time in a long while, I was simply enjoying my own life on my own terms. I heard about Ryan occasionally, mostly secondhand. He'd moved into a much smaller role at a different company, nothing close to the executive life he once imagined for himself. Someone mentioned that an industry magazine had run a feature on the Hartwell Trust, my name attached to several of the changes we'd made at Sterling Group. Apparently he'd come across it, started reading, and stopped partway through, unable to finish it. I don't know exactly what stopped him, whether it was guilt, regret, or something else entirely. I didn't spend much time wondering. These days, I don't carry anger about any of it the way I once thought I might. What I carry instead is a quiet, steady kind of peace, the kind that comes from finally being known for who you really are. Ryan underestimated me long before he ever truly saw me, and in the end, that mistake cost him far more than he ever expected it to.